our event, taking a comprehensive approach in response to COVID-19 and the financing the SDGs. The event will be starting shortly. We'll begin with a few housekeeping rules. So this session will be recorded and will be made available to participants and also to our SDGP network. During the event, the speakers will address some of the questions that was submitted during the registration process. We also encourage you to be active, to actively participate by asking questions in the Q&A, and these boxes, these questions will be answered during the event or during the Q&A. We welcome you to participate actively and also follow us on Twitter. I'll now hand over to our moderator, Professor Amil Pasik, the Dean of Philanthropic Studies at the Lilly School of Philanthropy. Welcome, Amil.
Thank you so much, Wanjiro, and welcome everybody to this very exciting panel. We have a wonderful set of panelists to address the issue of philanthropy in engaging the SDGs and the COVID-19 crisis at the same time. Philanthropy is nothing new to the United Nations. If it were not for the Rockefellers, the UN headquarters would not have the ground that it sits on. The Hague Peace Palace, where we have the International Court of Justice, was donated by Carnegie. But it is not only wealthy individuals, we also have intensive engagement by corporations that you will hear about through facilities like the UN Compact, and even everyday citizens have ways of engaging with development issues and responding to need through the grassroots efforts of agencies like UNICEF as well. So there are a variety of opportunities for non-state actors and individuals and philanthropy to engage the UN system, and we have a wonderful set of panelists who will help bring some organization and coherence to these opportunities and the processes that are already underway as we look for a new era for philanthropic engagement with the UN system as well. We have a partnership here of several organizations, and each person will tell you a little bit about the organization as we try to bring more information to philanthropy and how we can engage these important issues for the future of the globe. I will proceed to give you a very short introduction to our eminent panelists, and then they will respond to some certain salient questions and give you more context about the issues that we will be discussing today. I will introduce them very briefly in order of their appearance. Our first panelist is Marcos Neto. He's the director of the Finance Hub at UNDP. Welcome, Marcos. Thank you so much for joining this important panel. Our second speaker will be Dr. Una Osili. She serves as the Associate Dean for Research and International Programs at the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy, where I also have the privilege of being based as well. Next, we will hear from Kinga Ila, a Vice President of Thought Leadership and Communications from Charities Aid Foundation of America. Last but not least, we will hear from Nadya Hernández, Program Manager at WINGS, the Worldwide Initiatives for Grant-Making Support. Each of these organizations has a different and important role to play in bringing knowledge to practice when it comes to philanthropy and the SDGs, and also to the response to the COVID-19 crisis. As Wanjiro mentioned, please put your questions in the question and answer box so that we can have as an interactive an opportunity as possible. There, I can see from the names that there is, from the few that I recognize, that there is quite important expertise in our attendees as well. So we look forward to hearing from you as well. So let us start with Marcos. Marcos, I think your role is to give us a framing sense of the strategic role of philanthropy as a driver of innovative finance and sustainable development and COVID-19 response with the UN framework and the immediate socioeconomic response to COVID-19. Marcos, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are. You know, I'm coming to you from New York City. It's a very different, today usually is the busiest day of the year in the UN. Is the high level opening of the President's be here and we should be all be barricade and under perimeters. And as those are unprecedented times, nothing has happened. It's a normal day in New York and very empty. Nobody's here. As a physical representation, if we all needed, of the times that we're living in with COVID. COVID has affected and upheaved all of our lives in different ways, but without a doubt, it has affected the most vulnerable around the world. Few statistics to you, as we know globally, we are north of 950,000 deaths of COVID. We have 1.5 billion children and youth that are impacted by school closures, with a massive digital gap on going on right now in terms of kids that can access school through remote learning, and large numbers of kids that can't, exacerbating issues of inequality that, if nothing else, COVID didn't create it, but it just surfaced, made it very clear to all of us everywhere in the world, those issues of inequality. The global economy is about to shrink by 5.2%, the deepest recession since Second World War. We have about anywhere between 70 to 100 million people that are going down back into poverty, right? We as a the United Nations Development Program, we have been, publishing this index called the Human Development Index. And this is the 30th year of consecutive Human Development Index, and never before the whole index went down. And this is going to happen for the first time due to this COVID crisis. The crisis, as I said, affects people differently and affects the most vulnerably in a worse way. It has huge negative impact on gender equality. Women disproportionately work on the insecure labor force of the informal economy, which has no access to any kind of social protection. So we are seeing a disproportional effect on women. 265 million people of low and middle income countries at risk of acute food insecurity. And $110 billion have happened as a drop in remittances, which is another fundamental way by which most vulnerable receive support from around the world. Now, faced with this double crisis, a health crisis and economic crisis, the United Nations system has put together a socioeconomic framework, and we at the United Nations Development Program have the pleasure to technically lead this framework together with our assistant agencies and the resident coordinating system in each country in that sense. At the moment, we have conducted more than, if I'm not mistaken, more than 70 or 100 socioeconomic impact assessments, which are starting to surface how this crisis is playing itself out in each country around the world, and what are the patterns that you see around the world. Now, those socioeconomic impact assessments are now leading to socioeconomic recovery plans, and we at UNDP are supporting 100 governments in bringing together those socioeconomic recovery plans, which is going to be an essential element, not only to deal with the immediate elements of the crisis, but to get back, right, to the Sustainable Development Goals, to the Decade of Action going forward until 2030 in that sense. What is the role of philanthropy, and why does it matter so much? Well, let's be honest, there is a finance element here. Philanthropy globally have already allocated in the 6 months of this crisis $11.9 billion, far surpassing any other crisis in history. So that's the generosity of philanthropy as, if you want, a financing stakeholder. But more important than that, the innovation, the flexibility, the speed by which you, philanthropic organizations, are able to respond, it's incredibly important. The Gates Foundation work on vaccines, the Rockefeller Foundation work in the United States, for example, with the states on testing, the innovations of the Ford Foundation on financial instruments, creating its own bond to raise its commitment in the moment of crisis, are all very large examples of very large foundations. But as you might hear across corporate foundations, community foundations, smaller foundations are all chipping in this process. And this chipping in together is very important. You know, for us, and you know, back before the Sustainable Development Goals were created, we partner with the Hilton Foundation, with Ford Foundation, with Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors, with Wings in creating the SDG Philanthropy platform. It was a mechanism to allow philanthropy to have a voice on what became the SDGs and how the SDGs get to be implemented, get to be transformed into national development plans, and how philanthropy can work together with business, with governments, with the multilateral system, right, to maximize and leverage the other resources and generate a larger impact. Never before we need that kind of coming together than now. The crisis is so deep, the problems are so big that no single stakeholder can do this alone. We need to come together, right? Therefore, those 100 socioeconomic recovery plans that I've mentioned that we are working with governments can become your blueprint, can become your understanding on how do you fit in each country and globally in a constellation, an ecosystem that allows your dollars, that $11.9 billion, to leverage much larger resources from other stakeholders, but above all, to make sure that we come out of this crisis better, to make sure that we are able, right, to build back better. You know, Prime Minister Winston Churchill used to say that we can never let a crisis go to waste. It is very difficult for all of us, for anyone, for the most vulnerable part of all of our societies to deal with this moment now. But we almost owe to more than 950,000 people that have died worldwide to use the opportunity that COVID-10 to press a reset button on the world that we live and come out of this in a much more inclusive society, a much more resilient society, prepare to what is coming around the corner, which is the climate crisis, and to come it together, to realize that we are all part of an ecosystem of governance, an ecosystem of finance, right? And that if we don't come together, if we don't organize and work towards a common purpose, it will be very difficult to come out of this crisis. So I offer to you, joint with my colleague Nadya from Wings, the SDG Philanthropy platform as a mechanism to welcome you inside the discussions globally at the UN, but nationally around the socioeconomic recovery plans. Please join us. We can recover better together. Thank you, Amir.
Thank you, Marco, for that inspiring and welcoming message among the many serious challenges that we face. Let us next turn to Una Osili. Una, can you share with us the perspective from the Lilly Family School Philanthropy on the role of philanthropy in achieving the SDGs and the challenging global landscape that we face now?
Thank you, Amir, and thank you to all of you who are gathered here and my fellow panelists. It's a pleasure to join so many thoughtful and informed voices on this topic. Before the COVID pandemic, there was a lot of attention placed on how the world, the global community, would achieve the SDGs. Many of us know there was a significant funding gap already, $2.5 to $3 trillion needed to achieve the SDGs annually, with significant shortfalls in commitments needed. And then we had an unprecedented crisis and a cascading crisis in the sense that it was both a health crisis as well as an economic crisis, with many of the world's vulnerable populations disproportionately impacted. And that leads us to a question which we asked at the onset of this crisis, which is, what is the role of philanthropy in these very difficult and unprecedented times? There's a short-term role for philanthropy, and certainly keeping the SDGs in mind. Philanthropy in the past and in this crisis has played a role as an innovator, as a collaborator, and as a partner to government. No single sector on its own can meet the enormity of the challenge that the world is facing. Philanthropy also has a unique role to address gaps, the role of philanthropy is to lift up equity and inclusion concerns, and we're seeing that around the world, whether it's gender-based, whether it's ethnic and racial disparities. We're seeing philanthropy really step up, not just in meeting the immediate COVID crisis, but some of the cascading social justice and racial justice concerns around the world. In the medium term and the long term, there's also been increased attention as this crisis unfolds in the role philanthropy can play in resilience, in helping communities rebuild and recover, in identifying some of the innovative solutions that have been surfaced during this crisis, and promoting those solutions in a way that can be tailored to communities' needs. And finally, in a world where we desperately need ties that bring us together in social cohesion, we've also seen philanthropy around the world build trust, educate, and be a source of reliable information. I'm also very pleased to say that later this month, the school will launch a new project, actually 2 new projects. The first one is the Global Philanthropy Resource Flows Index that tracks how much is going to fund some of the most vulnerable populations around the world from the philanthropic sector. What we've identified to date is that in terms of cross-border flows, we have identified $834 billion is the overall amount in terms of these cross-border flows. And we're seeing that private remittances are still a very significant component of these cross-border flows. Private philanthropy also plays a significant role. Official development assistance, which we all know to be very important, is a smaller component in this larger landscape. What we're starting to see is the private sector really take the lead, whether it's foreign direct investment, private capital flows and remittances, as well as private philanthropy. We know that the development landscape has changed from what it looked like in the 1950s and 60s. And today's development arena is much more complex. There are many more actors. There are new tools that are being used. And finally, there's an emphasis on how these different sectors can collaborate and innovate together. In terms of what we have been doing at the Lilly Family School, at the onset of this crisis, we launched a new approach which involved surveying countries around the world and philanthropic experts around the world to gauge how the philanthropic sector was meeting this moment. The survey was launched in March. We received responses from around the world. There are about 79 countries included in our Global Philanthropy Environment Index, and we received responses from between 40 and 50 of those country experts to get a sense of how the sector, the philanthropic sector, was responding to the crisis. We asked those country experts to actually touch on several topics, and I'll just mention a few of those questions. We asked how the government response was affecting private philanthropy. That was the first question. We asked them how philanthropy was playing a role in this crisis. What were the key challenges and innovations that the philanthropic sector was experiencing? And what would improve cross-sector collaboration, understanding that without proper coordination and collaboration, it would be very difficult for any single sector to achieve outcomes. One of the key findings from this survey is that there is increased collaboration taking place. I think that's the good news. We're seeing in many different parts of the world, governments at the local, state, and even national level work with the private sector and the NGO sector in a way that hasn't been done before. So I think, as Marcos mentioned, in every crisis, there's also an opportunity embedded in this moment. And we're seeing many sectors and many countries rise to meet that challenge. There's also been a large-scale innovation taking place, and that is happening in the health sector, in education, in agriculture, and food security across many domains. And the questions that many experts are asking is, how can we take some of these solutions forward and scale them up to meet some of the development goals that have already been established? In terms of recommendations, what did the experts say? The experts actually emphasized just 3 points really that I'll mention. Given the way the philanthropic sector has emerged in many countries around the world, there's an emphasis on how do you remove barriers for NGOs to receive funding to do their work more effectively. There's been a lesson learned in this crisis that in many ways, the NGOs and the philanthropic sector can be that first responder in a crisis. How do we remove barriers to make their work more effective? The second recommendation, which we've already seen evidence of, is the need for increased coordination. Given that in a crisis, these sectors need to work together, how can we promote more coordination and collaboration, especially among funders? The third, and one that we at the Lilly Family School heartily resonate with, is how do we improve the global infrastructure for data sharing? One of the things we've learned doing this work is that there is no single place that one can go to obtain data on global philanthropy or even national philanthropy in many countries. So many of our country experts have actually issued a call to action, which I invite all of us to join on. How do we improve the data available so that actors at all levels can do their best work? And then finally, one that we also resonate with already, we've seen an outpouring of support in this crisis. It's come from high net worth individuals, but it's also come from everyday citizens who have reached out to help their neighbors in need. Those of us in the social sciences have heard about mutual aid for a long time. We're seeing mutual aid really play a role because communities at the grassroots often know where the needs are and are best positioned to meet those needs. The best example I give here is something that I saw both here in the United States and also in Nigeria, where I grew up, where when the schools were shut down and many students moved to virtual learning, we saw local philanthropists and the business sector quickly move in to provide tablets for students so they could participate, but television stations offered to use their platforms to actually provide e-learning. In some cases, it was radio stations, the private sector, that offered to partner to allow children to have a seamless transition during this crisis. As we move forward, I think there is also a call to action. Philanthropy has indeed played an unprecedented role in this crisis in helping communities absorb the initial effects of the economic and health crisis. But going forward, as communities start to think about rebuilding, and in some communities still emerging from this crisis, there is still a role for philanthropy to play most acutely in addressing the needs of the most vulnerable around the world. COVID, more than anything else, has exposed the deep, I think, gaps in safety nets, not just in the the poorest countries in the world, but even in the wealthiest and most prosperous economies in the world. So I think one piece of a call to action that I think philanthropy and our experts have issued is the need to continue to lift up equity and inclusion concerns in a way that communities can rebuild and recover and also become more resilient going forward if attention is placed on the most vulnerable in our societies. So with that, I'll stop here and turn it back over to the moderator.
Thank you so much, Una. And these are fascinating findings from the field. And perhaps before we turn to the audience, we can ask the panelists after we're done with the first set of presentations to react to some of those before we turn it to the audience. But importantly, we have another set of important research coming from Charities Aid Foundation of America. So let's turn the floor to Kinga Ile.
Thank you, Amir. It's great to be here. Yes, the SDG Giving Landscape report is a report which we completed earlier, and it offers an insight into the philanthropic funding of the SDGs from 2016 through 2019. So while it pertains to a specific donor base, the data can be considered indicative of greater trends, given CAF America's diverse donor groups, which includes corporate donors, foundations, individual donors, especially high net worth individuals, given the global nature of the grants and the large variety of issues to which funding is being directed. So this report, the SDG Giving Landscape report, identifies the SDGs that receive the most funding in aggregate. So throughout this entire period and from all donors. But it also looks at how the giving landscape has changed year over year. And it explores how giving to the SDGs varies on a regional basis. How it changes also based on the funding source, whether the funding is coming from corporate donors, from foundations, or from individual giving. So focusing first on the philanthropic funding of the SDGs from 2016 through 2019, it is noteworthy that donors supported a very broad range of issue areas. So while the level of funding, of course, was different per each SDG, distribution of giving during this time period covered all 17 SDGs. The 5 SDGs that were most supported in aggregate, so again, throughout the entire period and by all donors, were quality of education, which was followed very closely by good health and well-being, followed by sustainable cities and communities, life on land, and no poverty. So looking at the data from the past 6 months though, how did giving change? The landscape did change, not surprisingly. Zero hunger, an SDG which was not previously among the top 5 most supported, received the most funding. Good health and well-being remained in the same position. It was the second most funded SDG. Then we've seen industry, innovation, and infrastructure as an SDG with a lot of funding. Sustainable cities and communities, SDG 11. Previously, it was in the 3rd position, now appears in the 4th. And then quality education, previously the most funded SDG, continues to be among the most funded, but slides to the 5th position. So now that I gave a little bit of insight about the most funded SDGs in the past and currently, I want to take this opportunity to turn towards the more recent reports which we've been completing, the COVID-19 reports. Since March, when the novel coronavirus pandemic was declared a pandemic, we conducted a series of surveys to understand the unfolding impact of the crisis, how nonprofits are dealing with the challenges. And we wanted to inform donors of the sector's agile response, really. Una mentioned innovation. Marcos mentioned flexibility and how the philanthropic sector adapts. We've seen this in the surveys we conducted, in the responses we received. The series is comprised of 5 volumes. The first 3, The Voice of Charities Facing COVID-19 Worldwide, aggregate responses of over 1,700 charities worldwide. The 4th report, the 4th volume, adds the corporate voice to the series, provides an insight into the corporate philanthropic efforts since the pandemic began. And the 5th report, The Face of Charities During COVID-19 Worldwide, which we are actually releasing later on today, details the findings of the survey we conducted just earlier this month, so in September, and highlights 10 compelling stories. We interviewed a few charities. We sat down with them to get a more personal insight into the experiences there during COVID and how they're dealing with the challenges. Well, based on these reports, first the bad news. Exploring the survey responses, it's really a bleak picture which comes into focus. The majority are negatively impacted by the pandemic. Over 90% of the respondents in every single survey indicated that they are feeling significant negative impacts of the pandemic. And when asked about their ability to persevere, 1/3 of the respondents in July said that they are likely to be forced to close down within the next 12 months if the situation doesn't change. And more recently in our survey, this number is still 1/4 of the respondents. And as Una mentioned, this refers not only to organizations worldwide, it refers to organizations which are well established and which have been working for a long time in the field. yet again, their very existence is being endangered by the pandemic. Nevertheless, there's good news too. In spite of experiencing an increased demand for their services while seeing a decrease in the contributions they received, and in the face of unprecedented challenges, really, the sector is demonstrating resilience through agility and determination. Nonprofits around the world have adapted their operations, their programs, their services to better respond to the immediate needs, but also to remain in operation. And luckily, donors also sprung into action. What we've seen from the corporate response, corporate donors, has been actually very inspiring. And I'll give you a couple of data points here. 70% of our corporate respondents, so from volume 4, where we were asking corporations about their reaction to the pandemic, and this was a broader survey beyond just this, beyond the donors of CAF America. So 72% of corporate respondents increased their giving during the pandemic. And among these, actually 13% increased more than 50% their giving. Over 77% provided immediate relief funding, 52% funded new grantees, and approximately 65% allowed for funding to be redirected. So now to highlight just a few trends, 3 trends we have seen emerging in relation to COVID-19 and which we think might influence giving from now on as well. First, as mentioned before, COVID-19 demonstrates the interconnectedness of the issues, underscores the importance of systemic approach, and in response, donors have shifted their strategies. We've seen over 30% of respondents to our corporate survey indicating that they broadened the issue areas they are supporting. They added health and well-being, zero hunger, no poverty, gender equality, and other aspects, other issue areas, which maybe they have not been supporting before. It is important to note, before I move on from here, is that while 77% provided immediate relief funding, so funding very much related to COVID-19 relief efforts, over 46% continued their regular project funding. So funding on projects, existing projects, did not stop. And here, something which also emerged from the surveys in the commentaries we received. The events from the past few months and the Black Lives Matter movement had a similar effect of broadening the issue areas supported by corporate donors. Actually, in volume 4, the respondents have indicated a more intentional focus on applying a racial equity and social justice lens to their corporate philanthropy. From now on, many of them have been doing that before. They're looking at it not only to their domestic giving, but also to international, bringing it to their international giving. Second, COVID-19 showed how critical the NGOs are in providing vital services, and therefore the importance of their resilience, of sustaining the sector. So here the corporate donor sector reacted by offering greater flexibility in funding. Approximately 49% of the respondents indicated that they allowed funding to be used for operational purposes. So salaries, technology, rent, utilities. Over 45% indicated that they provided need-based funding. They actually asked their nonprofit partners what are the most needs and provided funding specifically to address these needs. And finally, I want to mention as a third point is that the fact that COVID-19 helped advance partnerships. It's been mentioned before by Una, it's been mentioned as a call to action. And here I'm going to give you a little bit of insight into the results of our latest surveys, volume 5. Approximately 65% of the respondents indicated that they are currently exploring partnership opportunities with other organizations to address challenges faced during the pandemic. We also asked about their opinion on how partnerships can be helpful. 60% indicated that they believe that partnerships help unlock new funding opportunities, which is crucial during this time when fundraising has been so much more challenging. And approximately 48% actually have donors who indicated an interest to fund collaborative projects. So to summarize, in the past 6 months, we have seen a broadening of the supported issue areas, not just supporting issues which align closely with the corporate social responsibility, with the corporate focus, but going a little bit beyond. And especially corporate donors have been indicating that they are going to maintain a broader focus issue areas. We have seen increased flexibility in funding, and we have seen a more focused strategic focus on partnerships. So before I conclude, all reports, of course, are available on our line and on our website, and I'll stop here for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Kinga. That's the wonderful service that you're providing with through the field with these reports. And I was going to ask you if it was on your website, and I'm glad it is. I'm teaching a course on philanthropy and crisis, so I have some new readings to offer my students later this semester. Let's now turn to Nadya with Wings. Nadya, please give us a sense of why it's important to create and support a more enabling environment philanthropy in order to advance this comprehensive approach to COVID-19 and the SDGs.
Thank you very much, Amir, and thank you very much to all our colleagues for sharing all this data and interesting reflections. I will say that the short answer to the question will be that without an enabling environment, it will be impossible for philanthropy to fulfill its potential and to actually contribute in the way that Marcos, Una, and Kinga were suggesting. Like in a more detailed answer, we will say that an enabling environment for philanthropy is not just important, but urgent and highly needed. And we know that the sector has key challenges, and actually we know that the threats to civic freedoms have multiplied and intensified recently. Yesterday, I was looking at the ICNL's tracker regarding COVID-19, and they were mentioning that the pandemic has unleashed a parallel crisis for civic space. So we have the health crisis, we have the economic crisis, but we also have a crisis connected to the civic space. And many of the emergency laws and other extraordinary measures adopted in response to the virus restrict fundamental rights and freedoms, which is of course concerning. But we know that other restrictions that were in place before the pandemic have been affecting the sector for a long time. So we know that there is restrictions on foreign funding and giving worldwide. We know that there are barriers to operate and receive funding. We know that there are like some legal registration barriers, also criminal labels and penalties, even when there is a positive public purposes of the funds that have been received. But I would like to reflect a bit on what we are talking about when we talk about an enabling environment for philanthropy, because at Wings, we would like to offer a vision that includes 3 different categories to look at these issues. So the first category, it's connected to the conditions to operate and exist. So here we can think about the legal and the fiscal frameworks that include different aspects, and also some of the cultural and political frameworks that can contribute or hinder the conditions where philanthropy exists and operates. Then we have the second category that is connected to the conditions to grow. So we know that to develop philanthropy's volumes and diversity, we require different conditions like tax incentives or a favorable narrative, clear regulations, campaigns to grow a cultures of giving, technology, standards to build transparency and trust, and so on and so forth. Then the third category, and this is probably the category that we use to take into account are the conditions to catalyze philanthropy's impact. So we know that beyond allowing private resources for common good to flow and to grow, we need an enabling environment for the field that include mechanisms and actors that boost the impact of philanthropy and leverage its expertise. So this includes all the collaboration platforms with other actors, including, of course, business and government, data, as Una was mentioning and calling us to action, capacity building, and other mechanisms to identify best practices that could be scaled. But also we need well-articulated networks and umbrella organizations for philanthropy that can help make available all this knowledge and collective intelligence, but also to support and conduct effective advocacy. So knowing these categories that we have in mind when we are talking about enabling environment and the conditions that philanthropic actors, but broader civil society are facing, we also know that the SDGs are providing us with a framework that requires the contributions of all actors to be critical allies in these development goals. And it is important to remember, to remind policymakers of the importance of a strong philanthropic sector. And Una, in her presentation, was talking about the funding gap and the 2.5 to 3 trillions that we need to close that gap, and that we know that philanthropy could be a potential partner to contribute to it. But of course, that requires a more enabling environment. All the innovations and risks that that Marcus was sharing were needed to help to navigate this crisis. Of course, also required a more enabling environment, and then philanthropy will be able to risk-take different and explore different solutions and working closely with other actors to materialize this. And something else that I think it's very important to consider as part of this conversation is the fact that we all know that the SDGs materialized at the country level. And that's why local domestic philanthropy is so important. And local domestic philanthropy could help mitigate the negative impact of restrictions on foreign funding and may offer more stable long-term support to specific local needs and causes. So for that, it is of course very important to promote a narrative as part of that enabling environment to demonstrate the legitimate role that philanthropy has. But we all know, and also from the presentations of our colleagues today, that a strong local philanthropy sector does not emerge automatically. We know that philanthropy needs to be considered increasingly as a strategic ally in developing domestic funding for civil society. And here is where WINGS sees a strong case for philanthropy support ecosystem as a crucial element of that enabling environment. Because here is where it lies, like all the importance to build better and have better multi-stakeholder partnerships to understand the role of foundations and other philanthropic actors. So with all these points, we can see that all the flows that Kinga was sharing with us, and of course all the challenges that we have to remove, like concrete barriers to make the sector more effective, require a more enabling environment. If we want really to see philanthropy as a champion on the social economic response, if we want to see foundations and other philanthropic actors contributing effectively to development, this will of course depend on the conditions to perform as it best at the local, regional, and global level. So I think that it's important for all of us to make sure that we contribute to the conversations to facilitate those conditions, to raise awareness on the importance of this environment, and of course to understand philanthropy in the broader possible way, to make sure that we will be better to build back better, leave no one behind, and ultimately make like an important contribution to a better world for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nadya. The importance of the enabling environment, I think, is reflected in why we're gathered here right now. I mean, I think the enabling environment is very much some of the talent that we have assembled here and the important research and insights that, that we have been sharing. Before we turn to the audience, and I see people have started to put their questions in the question and answer box, so I encourage folks to do that. I want to pause and give the panelists an opportunity to react to what they heard from each other, either to amplify or to ask questions before we turn to the audience, be it on any of the findings that were shared or any of the comments that were made.
Just from my side, I mean, no, I think the issue of the enabling environment is essential. It is really an important area of collectively work, especially in emerging economies and developing countries, right? So we can actually have a thriving philanthropic community. But it's also very important that, you know, the question of accountability of philanthropy, right? So, you know, I think it is important that philanthropy anticipates in this conversation of of enabling environment, what is offering in terms of accountability, right? What is offering in terms of alignment with, you know, national priorities and national plans. You know, not that, you know, philanthropy needs to work, you know, exclusively hand in hand with governments or anything like that. But, you know, that, I think that debate is an important debate, you know, on the two sides of that enabling environment, if you want, or actually on multiple sides of an enabling environment. Thanks.
I would just like to add that at the Lilly Family School, we have been tracking the Global Philanthropy Environment Index. We have a project actually called the Global Philanthropy Environment Index, which tracks the enabling environment in 79 countries. That study does find that 2 out of 5 countries have a restrictive environment for philanthropy. In other words, there are barriers to organizations operating, there are barriers to funding, and other types of restrictions. We've also looked at the incentives, what unleashes philanthropy around the world? What are the factors that actually provide not just an enabling environment, but allow philanthropy to thrive ultimately? And some of those are well documented, but I think we've also learned a lot during the COVID-19 pandemic about what does enable philanthropy to thrive. And one example that I just wanted to offer up actually comes from Vietnam, where private donors and NGO leaders saw that to provide food in a pandemic, you had to avoid social distancing. So they set up food banks, but actually rice ATMs that allowed people to come collect their rice and not necessarily be in community with others to comply with social distancing. So we're starting to see innovation at the grassroots level. And I think my other recommendation at this point from our research is we need to also look at what is working right now, how are different organizations navigating, and what can we do to rebuild the infrastructure so not only can philanthropy function, but ultimately address some of the most pressing needs and at the community level.
Thank you, Una. Nadya.
Yes, I would like to thank Una and Marcus for their comments. And I also think that this pandemic, as Marcos was saying, it's offering us an opportunity to build better standards for our field and to make sure that we have strong values, principles, but also mechanisms to be more transparent and make sure that that we are providing the right information to the right people in the right institutions. So I think that this crisis is certainly allowing philanthropy to be self-critic and reflective, but also to drive concrete action. And I think that there are also like good examples on how we can drive that change and ensure that we use this crisis as an opportunity to almost rebuild the principles of our field and make sure that that it's also driving us to long-lasting impact.
Amir,
Kinga, please go ahead. Yes.
In our survey with the corporations, we actually asked what kind of challenges they faced in giving in the past 6 months. And as you can imagine, we were thinking about the enabling environment. We were thinking about challenges around funding, transferring funds. We were thinking about identifying new organizations. And I can tell you that about 25% indicated that it was harder to work with new grantees just because of the due diligence which needs to be done in order for them to be eligible to receive funding from the United States. But 25% when it's an immediate response, I think it's actually not such a bad percentage. They also, about 27% indicated that they had some issues with transferring funds to the grantees. So just to give you a little bit of insight about these past 6 months specifically.
Yeah, thank you very much. Clearly, there's a lot of turbulence in the field, and at the same time that we have growing inequality, there's a growing realization that needs to be addressed, and the lens of racial equity and inclusion that several of you have mentioned, I think, is increasingly important. Let's turn to some of the questions that were posed when people were registering, and one of them has to do with something that most of you have touched upon, and that is the relation between the response to the current pandemic, COVID-19, and the future of the response to the SDGs. And what in your perspective is going to have to be changed in terms of our engagement with the SDGs as a result of the lessons we're learning from the COVID response?
I would like to say that something that we have been seeing along this discussion, but also in other settings, it's that we need to learn how to be better at building multi-stakeholder partnerships. So how philanthropic actors can better join forces with country governments or local governments, but also the private sector, business, broader civil society. I think that there is a huge question mark, and we know that also there are great practices, and it will be very important to collect them and learn from them, and make sure that we disseminate and somehow scale those learnings. And also I think that probably we will need to be better at having honest conversations and making sure that we also discuss what hasn't worked and how we can better address that next time that we try to build partnerships and build better connections with other actors. So I think that that will be one of the first points that I would like to offer for discussion.
Thank you, Nadya. Marcos.
I agree with Nadya's point in terms of the need to work better together. And I've said that at the beginning, and perhaps, based on our own experience of working on a multi-stakeholder partnership with philanthropy since 2014, I would say that, the governments and NGOs and the multilateral system, we need to look at philanthropy not as an ATM machine. I think that is important that we understand that philanthropy has way more to offer than money, right? To this conversation in that sense, right? But at the same time, it's very important that philanthropy understands and agrees that its strategic decisions in a particular country need to be connected, right? As much as with the priorities that are decided by, you know, the high net worth individual or the board of a institution of philanthropy in the United States that comes back and says, you know, our priorities is educational or health or this or that. Fine, that is the right of the governance of any philanthropic, of the desire of any founder of a philanthropy. But the translation of that to the realities of Kenya or Ghana must be done, right, in alignment with what it means to integrate education into, you know, the Kenya plans for education. What does it mean, you know, to do that? And I think sometimes, and I've seen it, that is very difficult for individual philanthropists to do that. You know, and to some degree, that is the question of of double accountability. Now, yes, you have an accountability to your board, you have an accountability to the priorities that are made in there, but you have to have an accountability to the local realities where you're trying to help. And I think that is a struggle for philanthropy around the world, small and large.
No, go ahead.
Yes, I think I want to add another point that hasn't been mentioned yet. With all the challenges we're facing, one thing that has surfaced in our own work on these issues is that there has been too little emphasis on building the data infrastructure. That's both at the country level, at the regional level, but ultimately at the global level. So if you think about foreign direct investment, if you think about remittances, we have a system that's been developed, an architecture for collecting the data, making it available. When it comes to philanthropy, there is a real scarcity of data. And I don't think that we can achieve some of the accountability goals, the coordination and collaboration goals, and ultimately the impact that we desire without that data. So that's one big area. The other insight that we have received collecting this data and trying to make it available is how do we engage grassroots organizations? So too often the work that is being done is happening usually with very large organizations, and the work itself is being implemented by grassroots organizations. We've also seen during this pandemic that it's those grassroots organizations that have shown the most sort of creativity, agility, and willingness to meet the moment and start a movement to meet, whether it's food insecurity, virtual schooling, any number of challenges. So with this insight, I think as we think about recovery and rebuilding, it's important to make sure that grassroots organizations and grassroots leaders are at the table to ensure that the voices of communities, I think that Marcos has referenced, are at the table when discussions are being made about recovery and rebuilding, and that going forward, we do not leave those voices out of the discussion.
Una, I couldn't agree more on the data and bringing the voices to the forefront. It's very important to know what is happening in the field, to know what is the experience on the ground. And many times we're surprised. Some of the findings from our surveys point to very surprising outcomes here in the United States with schools, with students, entire groups of students not being able to have access to virtual learning. You wouldn't expect that here maybe, but it's happening. And then back to Amira, to your question, how can we use this now? I think COVID-19 helps us bring a heightened sense of urgency to the SDGs. It's a case study for the SDGs. It's an issue which is relevant locally and globally. It is an issue which affects us all, and the response has to be systemic. This is what the SDGs were calling from the beginning. That's the framework. That's why they're there. And then finally, I want to go back a little bit to the conversation on the partnership and the importance of coordinated efforts with the government. A small example in this in this field. Actually, we've been working with an organization from Ecuador, Por Todos. And this is an organization which brought together the government and businesses to fund COVID-19 relief efforts in the country. And what they've done together is they they worked with us to open an area of interest fund. And actually both the government and the business leaders from Ecuador are using this fund to connect with diaspora members here in the United States and help raise funds to have a more effective response in the country to this particular crisis. So I think this is a good example of something very specific which can happen, and it doesn't have to be a big plan. It doesn't have to be too complex. Taking small steps counts, in my opinion, and we've seen this in the field.
That's terrific, and to this theme of innovation, flexibility, agility that many of you have mentioned. Marcos's invocation of Churchill's notion of not to waste a crisis. Are there other examples of learnings from the crisis that will help us as we move out of it that any of you would like to share? Examples.
Mainly,
go ahead, Nadya.
No, sorry. I think that we at Wings, we have collected different examples around the world, and we have COVID-19 Resource Hub looking at the different efforts that the philanthropic actors around the world have undertaken, from calls to actions, to surveys, to publications, to concrete collaboration examples around the world. So I think that we have right now more than 250 resources. And I think that I would like to encourage our audience to look at this webpage. And of course also to share their own findings. I think that sometimes we have a lot of examples, but at the same time it's hard to look at them with the detail and the care that it requires. But I think that this is also, of course, connected to all the data and knowledge discussion that we were having before. But from our network and from other actors, we have been collecting this since March. So I think this can be a good source of inspiration, and also, of course, to explore further the question that you were asking, Amir.
I mean, I think there's two things that would bring it to the table. One is in the United States, there has been a very interesting development, if you want, led by Ford Foundation, but it has involved other institutional foundations, which is this notion of a counter-cycle play for philanthropy in the middle of a crisis. That never happened before. In the past, what happened was the economic downturn means that philanthropy reduces its footprint, as its endowment reduces, therefore in the United, this is, for anybody listening to us outside the United States context, is very American driven here. As your endowment reduces, your 5% reduces, and you want to maintain the endowment, and then, then it comes forward at this moment and says, actually, the crisis is so big that we need to go counter-cycle. We need to actually give it put more finance out in the market, and more flexible, more in the categories that Kinga was mentioning in that sense. Right, and then it goes and innovates, basically creates a bond, raises $1 billion in the market. It's a 30-year bonds, AAA, no problem. Now, not everybody can do this, but I think the lesson here is the role of philanthropy in a crisis is more, not less. Right, I think that is an important message. That I think we are learning from leaderships of some philanthropic organizations going forward. I think the second lesson that I take goes back to this sectoral work that has always dominated to some degree, modern philanthropy, and this whole notion of, philanthropy with log frames and all that stuff that we all touching on this, that makes it difficult for a small grassroots organization to receive and so on and so forth. I think what COVID has shown us, on top of the fact we already took the need to come together, is that, let's take education, a very important traditional sector of philanthropy, right? And I think Kinga's example in Ecuador is a very good one. So you want to do education, you got to start paying for iPads, right? Because it's no longer good enough for you as a philanthropic organization to prioritize education to figure out that, education means I need to work on the curriculum and training of teachers, right? In today's world, I got to deal with the infrastructure of education. And by the way, what is the point of you giving iPads when 1.5 billion people have no internet, right? So what is the responsibility? That just shows back this coming together. If your priority as a philanthropist is education anywhere in the world today, you need to put a coalition in place that deals with the infrastructure of broadband, that deals with the infrastructure of hardware, that deals with the curriculum, that deals with training teachers how to teach outside the school. Otherwise, there's no point or have a priority on the education sector any longer. So that, for me, is where philanthropy, the crisis, and by the way, this was the same before. It's not that, you could do education without all of those issues before the crisis. You couldn't, right? We pretended we could, but now it's clear that we can't. So that is where I think the lessons of this crisis are. And that is and we have to learn those lessons, because that's how we build back better.
Exactly. Una, go ahead.
Yes, I am very pleased to hear Marcos bring up the point of the Ford Foundation, because it speaks to a bigger question, which is, because this crisis is so unprecedented, we need to essentially expand the toolkit. This is a question, an issue that I think we've already seen taking place. Perhaps this will be an inflection point or catalyst for more thinking in this area. So traditionally, funders have used, you might think, grant making as their primary instrument of funding, and even individual donors have thought of more donations as their primary way of solving problems in the social sector. But today, around the world, but perhaps even at a faster pace in Asia, in Latin America, and sub-Saharan Africa, we're seeing funders very interested in how do we bring an expanded toolkit, tool chest, whatever word you prefer, to look at these problems. And it could be that it's not a grant to an educational institution, but rather it's an investment, an impact investment. Foundations have access to capital. They can make program-related investments, mission-related investments. The notion today, I think, is that when we look at a problem, it is not necessarily one solution to every single problem, but increasingly, how do we bring capital at scale to solve perhaps whether it's climate change, vaccine development? We're looking at problems that require a different lens. We already mentioned the notion of social justice, racial equity, gender equity in our thinking around philanthropy. But I think this is the moment where we start to also look at what are the new tools that are available that perhaps were not as available 20, 30 years ago, 100 years ago. With impact investing, our research does show an increased interest in impact investing across different actors, whether that's foundations, individual donors, high net worth individuals, or even everyday donors as well. And we're also, that's also an area where there is a data gap, where we'd like to know more about how impact investments are being used across the board. But it's also very exciting that many large funders are looking at some of these problems with a new sense of urgency, and to really tackle whether it's food insecurity, education, healthcare, there is a need to not just use the same tools in the same way we've used them before, but expand that notion of what tools can we use to solve the world's most pressing challenges.
Certainly, there's a lot of sense of urgency, which is great to see, and innovation with Ford and other big foundations trying to use some of these new mechanisms. Kinga, I see you unmuted. You would like to contribute.
Yes, I wanted to give a couple of examples along the same lines, but not necessarily from the big foundations. It's definitely a trend of seeing, what we have seen is increased giving in the past 6 months. But when we asked about what the future plans are, actually the responses were also encouraging. We asked what impact on the giving budget corporate donors expect for the next year. And 2/3 anticipate maintaining current levels or increasing funding. So I would say, to be more specific, 47% out of those 2/3 said that they are going to be maintaining it, but almost 20% said that they're going to increase it or significantly increase it. And another thing which I wanted to touch upon is that there is definitely a strong interest in driving support to the organizations working on the ground. Organizations, smaller organizations trying to get the support directly to them. Now, of course, there are cases when the way of getting the funding to these organizations is done through larger organizations, just because the local organization on the ground cannot meet the eligibility criteria. They have to pass either equivalency determination here in the United States to receive funding from the United States, which basically states that they're a nonprofit, which are equivalent to a US 501c3. Or they have to, the grantor has to do expenditure responsibility on the project which is funded. This is possible, and this is how work is being done most of the time and often, but in certain cases, depending on the expedience, that can be a little bit more difficult. Nonetheless, the interest is to actually fund organizations on the ground. And then there was a last point, which was basically around innovation, which was made a little bit earlier, and about how organizations reacted. And one of the things which the nonprofits shared as early on and throughout the surveys which we've been conducting is that access to technology is one of the biggest challenge. Not only, even if they can figure out how to take their programs online, how to provide these virtually, access to technology. So actually we have seen a lot of donors stepping up, and as you mentioned earlier, not just relying on grant funding, like sending funding, but giving in-kind donations, giving actual tablets or whatever that is. And in one case, an organization from South Africa, an organization which was an established organization filling a very important role in the region, was facing closing down because they didn't have access to infrastructure, to internet, to the technology which they needed. One donor stepped up and provided funding for operational expenses, and this is hopefully a trend which is going to continue in the future, a little bit more openness towards giving funding to cover technology, cover the needs, the salaries. And that's what happened in this South African example. They stepped in, they covered expenses of connecting to internet and provided technology, and the organization survived.
That's terrific. Well, certainly, data, as has been mentioned, is kind of a key resource and something that is relatively poorly developed in the philanthropic sector. There's a question in the box from somebody that is bringing up the issue of intermediary organizations and kind of the institutional forms in the philanthropic space. Janet Butler from United Way Worldwide Africa mentions the partnerships that come through United Way models, which are community chests, aggregators of donors and initiatives. There's also the Community Foundation model, that is spreading around the world as well. And obviously, CAF and WINGS and the SDG platform all represent in some ways efforts to intermediate, to make sure that the donor doesn't feel that they're by themselves and have to, blaze a new path, that there is a lot of knowledge and collaborators ready for them as well. Are there some evolutionary developments in this intermediary space? Are there new intermediaries that, in addition to the ones that we have gathered here today, that are emerging, that are contributing to what Nadya described as the enabling environment?
I can jump in and just mention that as part of our tracking efforts, one of our faculty members, Dr. Lori Paulberg, is the Mott Chair in Community Philanthropy at the Lilly Family School. And she, along with a team of scholars and graduate students, have put together a large-scale mapping project that looks at what's happening around the United States with community-level funds and United Ways. There has been more than $1 billion given through these community-level initiatives. In every state in the United States, there's at least one of those funds, but in many communities, United Ways and community foundations are working together. About over $500 million has already been dispersed at the community level. You can see that map and drill down into the community level to see what needs are being addressed. And I think what's important about that initiative is that those funds have been essentially initiated by different leaders and communities, and they're also working very hard to get those funds to where they can make the greatest impact. It would be ideal if we could have that information at a global level. That way you can see what gaps are still in existence and also which ones funders are addressing. And then for larger scale solutions, for example, for governments to partner, they can also see where those needs are. I think in the United States, what has been surfaced so far is that food insecurity has been a really big issue. We talked about the educational gaps, but also access to healthcare and employment. We've seen that some of those needs are really cascading and unfolding. So I think the model of community-led solutions is really at play here, and community foundations have been at the forefront of that during this crisis. But it would be interesting to see how we can take some of those learnings around data collection and expand them, because around the world, some of those same issues are present where funders want to know where the gaps are, who else is funding in a particular area. And it's very difficult to get that data in a timely fashion so that it's actionable.
Thank you, Una. Another theme that has been coming up a lot is the notion of inclusion, and we've seen some examples of really interesting grassroots initiatives. Kinga mentioned Por Todos, and Una mentioned the ATM, the Rice ATM as well. And we're becoming increasingly conscious of inclusivity, and yet when often we think about the SDGs and the scale of the pandemic, where large organizations like governments play such a key role. How do we marry the need for being systematic with the sense that we really want to be more inclusive and participatory and grassroots, so that people who are the beneficiaries participate in the solutions that need to be devised? What is some of the thinking that you have encountered that combines this kind of top-level need for systemic, collaborative, large-scale initiatives, but at the same time remaining responsive to the grassroots and inclusive of the voices of those that are most vulnerable?
I think over the years, several different approaches have been put in together from this, right? I think, being a Brazilian myself, I go back to, participatory budgets that have been created decades ago. So those are examples of very large, city-wise or state-wise official processes like budget that have been figured out a way by which you can actually take it all the way down to the beneficiaries and let them engage. On the SDG Philanthropy platform, the processes we run in Kenya, in Zambia, and in Indonesia, and in Colombia, in Brazil, were examples, right, of us using tools, out of Stanford and other places that were trying to create co-creation exercises, right? And when there were grassroots players in there. But an interesting element on that we haven't touched yet, and you've mentioned this, earlier about intermediation, is philanthropy itself played a role in the processes that we did it in Kenya and in Brazil and others, of bringing the voices of its own communities, its own beneficiaries to the table. And sometimes we forget, right? Goes back to the thing, the philanthropy is not an ATM machine, right? When philanthropy makes a grant, right? Maybe we forgot over the years with this excessive accountability and log frames and these and that that it becomes a constituency rather than a grantee, right? So when we did the co-creation exercises in Kenya, when we did the co-creation exercises in Brazil, philanthropy was actually representing the voices of those communities, right? So that's a role that sometimes philanthropy doesn't seize anymore. Now, not all, there's plenty of philanthropic organizations that sees that role was primarily their role. But that is an important point in that sense.
Thank you so much. Maybe we can either continue on this theme. I think we're kind of close to time, or allow each of the panelists to say a kind of a final comment or a final word. I think Kinga, you unmuted.
Yes, I did, and I'll take this opportunity then to add a little bit more to this conversation, but also conclude on this note. So what we have seen emerging on the margins of what we were discussing, so intermediaries, new types of intermediaries, but also grassroots, getting to organizations on the ground. We have been actually working like this at CAF America. We partner with organizations on the ground. We are part actually of the CAF Global Alliance. We have partner offices in Brazil, in the UK, in Australia, in South Africa, India, Bulgaria. So we use these experts on the ground to help us identify organizations on the ground, to help us identify organizations working in the local communities. And beyond our own partner offices, we've been working actually with other network organizations or local intermediary organizations, if you will, which serve as experts to connect us with organizations on the ground. So for example, in Latin America, we have connected with RAZI, which is a huge network organization, and they have knowledge of how others are working and who is working in what issue, and we can then bring these grassroots organizations in front of donors. Monte de Piedad, another example, an organization in Mexico, has a very strong knowledge of the local community. Wings does this. You have very strong knowledge of the local organizations. So donors having access to experts on the ground helps them connect with organizations on the ground. So again, it drives us back to partnership, different kinds of partnerships. Definitely this particular crisis is driving us in that direction. And I really do hope that we're going to take some of the trends which emerge now, the immediate response, the coordinated response, the openness to funding operational expenses, the openness for partnership and encouragement for partnership, although of course they have to be strategic and they're not easy. I really hope that we're going to see this in the future.
Thank you, Kinga. Una, last comment?
Yes, I'll just say that one thing that has been, with all the tragedy and crises that we've seen around the world, we've also seen innovation on a whole different level. And in particular, the social sector has really stepped up. We've heard a lot about the role of funders, but we've also seen grassroots organizations, nonprofit organizations, and local initiatives really look at problems with a new lens. And I hope that we can take this spirit of innovation forward. On the nonprofit side, this is really a moment for nonprofits and the NGOs around the world to really think about how they can drive innovation. I'm really encouraged by some of the examples we've seen, whether it's the rice banks in Vietnam or here in the United States, the CDC Foundation has been involved in large-scale crowdfunding efforts. And similarly, the World Health Organization, we haven't heard as much about this, but they've started a whole new effort to engage private donors. So this is really a time when we can not just go back to business as usual, but think about how we can do the work in the social sector with a new sense of urgency and with the new tools that we have available.
Thank you, Una. Nadya, would you like some final comments?
Yes. I think that it was a very interesting conversation, and we had the opportunity to address many of the topics that are alive inside of our network, as Una and Kinga, as part of Wings, know. I think that it's also, of course, very connected to all the conversations that we are having regards the future of the SDG Philanthropy platform with our colleagues from UNDP. So it was a very interesting conversation. There are like two things that I would like to share with the audience. So the first one is that I shared with you on the chat box the link to our COVID-19 resource hub, and we are planning to release more visual version by the end of this week. So it will be great if you can stay tuned and look at it and share with us your feedback. But also in this spirit of building better data and collecting examples and learning from what's happening at the country level and so on, we are also about to launch a research in October that will offer like concrete tools for philanthropic organizations to undertake concrete mappings and to look at the impact of the philanthropy support organizations at their own level. So I think that this will also certainly contribute to connect all the dots of the conversation that we had here today regarding the state of the philanthropy support ecosystem at the local level or national level or regional one, but also the questions on how we can strengthen like the impact of philanthropy and its contributions. So yeah, thank you very much to you all for this space.
Thank you, Nadya. And Marcos, you didn't know that those are your final words, so I want to give you an opportunity to say anything.
No. I think I've spoke too much. I just want to thank you, Amir, for managing this in a very nice an exciting conversation. And thank you all, Kinga, Nadya, Una, for joining us in this conversation, and more to come. Thank you.
Thank you all very much. This concludes this fascinating webinar. You'll be getting a recording and some resources where you can continue to participate. And as we heard, flexibility, agility, inclusiveness, and partnerships are what we'll need to face the future. So thank you all. Have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.